Honourable members, of course, none of this is easy. I think that everybody recognises that we have been living extremely challenging times, a real stress test to the European Union. We know also that the path of permanent and profound reform is as demanding as it is unavoidable. Let's make no mistake. There is no way back to business as usual. Some people believe that after this, everything will come back as it was before. They are wrong. This crisis is different. This is not a cyclical crisis, but a structural crisis. We will not come back to the old normal. We have to shape a new normal. We are in a transforming period of history. The European ideal touches the very foundations of European society. It is about values, and I underline this word, values. It is based on a firm belief in political, social and economic standards, grounded in our social market economy. In today's world, the European Union level is indispensable to protect these values and standards and promote citizens' rights, from consumer protection to labour rights, from women's rights to respect for minorities, from environmental standards to data protection and privacy. Whether defending our interests in international trade, securing our energy provision, or restoring people's sense of fairness by fighting tax fraud and tax evasion, only by acting as a union do we pull our weight at the world stage. Does anyone seriously believe that if the euro had collapsed, we or our member states would still have any credibility left internationally? Does everyone still realize how enlargement has been a success in terms of healing history's deep scars, in establishing democracies, where some years ago no one had thought it possible? How neighbourhood policy was and still is the best way to provide security and prosperity in regions of vital importance for Europe? Where would we be without all of this? And does everyone still remember just how much Europe has suffered from its wars during the last century and how European integration was the valid answer? Next year, it will be 1 century after the start of the First World War, a war that tore Europe apart, from Sarajevo to the Somme. We must never take peace for granted. We need to recall that it is because of Europe that former enemies now sit around the same table and work together. It is only because they were offered a European perspective that now even Serbia and Kosovo came to an agreement under the mediation of the European Union. Last year's Nobel Peace Prize reminded us of that historic achievement, that Europe is a project of peace. We should be more aware of it ourselves. Sometimes I think we should not be ashamed to be proud. One thing is arrogance. We don't want to be arrogant. But we should be proud of Europe, what we have achieved. We should look towards the future, but with the wisdom we gained from the past. Let me say this to all those who rejoice in Europe's difficulties and who want to roll back our integration and go back to isolation. The pre-integrated Europe of the divisions, the war, the trenches, is not what people desire and deserve. The European continent has never in its history known such a long period of peace as since the creation of the European communities. It is our duty to preserve it and to deepen it. Honourable members, there are those who claim that a weaker Europe would make their country stronger, that Europe is a burden. They will be better off without it. My reply is clear. We all need a Europe that is united, strong and open. In the debate that is ongoing all across Europe, the bottom line question is, do you want to improve Europe or give it up? My answer is clear. Let's engage. If you don't like Europe as it is, improve it. Find ways to make it stronger, internally and internationally, and you will have in me the firmest of supporters. Find ways that allow for diversity without creating discriminations, and I will be with you all the way. But don't turn away from it. I recognize, as any human endeavour, the European Union is not perfect. For example, controversies about the division of labour between the national and European levels will never be conclusively ended. I value subsidiarity highly. For me, subsidiarity is not a technical concept. It's a fundamental democratic principle. An ever closer union among the citizens of Europe demands that decisions are taken as open and transparently as possible, and as closely to the people as possible. Not everything needs a solution at European level. Europe must focus on where it can add most value. Where this is not the case, it should not meddle. The European Union needs to be big on big things and smaller on smaller things, something we may occasionally have neglected in the past. The European Union needs to show it has the capacity to set both positive and negative priorities. As all governments, we need to take extra care of the quality and quantity of our regulation, knowing that, as Montesquieu said, les lois inutiles affaiblissent les lois nécessaires. Useless laws weaken the necessary ones. But there are, honourable members, areas of major importance where Europe must have more integration, more unity, where only a strong Europe can deliver results. I believe a political union needs to be our political horizon, as I stressed in last year's State of the Union. This is not just demand of a passionate European. This is an indispensable way forward to consolidate our progress and ensure the future. Ultimately, the solidity of our policies, namely of the economic and monetary union, depend on the credibility of the political and institutional construct that supports it. Honourable members, the polarisation that resulted from the crisis poses a risk to us all, to the project, to the European project. We, legitimate representatives of the European Union, can turn the tide. You, direct democratic representatives of Europe, directly elected, you will be at the forefront of the political debate. The question I want to pose to you is the following. Which picture of Europe will voters be presented with? The candid version or the cartoon version? The myths or the facts? The honest, reasonable version or the extremist, populist version? It's an important choice to make. I know some people out there will say Europe is to blame for the crisis and hardship. But we can remind people that the European Union was not at the origin of the crisis. It resulted from mismanagement of public finances from the national governments and irresponsible behaviour in the financial markets. We can explain how Europe has worked to fix the crisis, what we would have lost if we had not succeeded in upholding the single market, because the single market was under threat, and upholding the common currency, because some time ago some people were predicting the end of the common currency. If we had not coordinated recovery efforts and employment initiatives, how would we be now? In 8 months' time, voters will decide. Now it's up to us to make the case for Europe. We can do so by using the next 8 months to conclude as much as we can. We have a lot to do still. Namely, adopt and implement the European budget, the MFF. This is critical for investment in our regions all over Europe. This is indispensable for the first priority we have, the fight against unemployment, notably youth unemployment. Another priority, advance and implement the banking union. This is critical to address the problem of financing for businesses and SMEs. These are our clear priorities, employment and growth. Our job is not finished, it is in its decisive phase. Let's not forget that 100 years ago, Europe was sleepwalking into the catastrophe of the war of 1914. Next year, in 2014, I hope Europe will be walking out of a crisis more united, stronger and open. I thank you for your attention.
Das Wort hat jetzt für die Fraktion der Konservativen Herr Kollege Callanan.
Europe needs a new direction, and that direction cannot be based on old ideas. Europe needs a new thinking. Now, they're not my words, Mr. Barroso, they're yours from the equivalent speech last year. The problem, of course, that yet again you haven't delivered on any of the big promises or any of the grand rhetoric that you've delivered year after year. Your chance to deliver that new direction has passed. The question now, I think, that we have to address is whether your successor will be able to deliver any of the change that the EU so desperately needs. Next year, the Commission will have a fresh leader, although personally I am not optimistic that he or she will come up with any fresh ideas. Indeed, many of the applicants for your job are here today. It's like a giant hustings meeting. Commissioner Reding, who I think has moved to the front bench now, is clearly running as the federalist candidate, producing more eye-catching babble every day that goes past. Commissioner Wren could be delivering the speech next year, although I suspect if he did, we'd all have a bit of a late lunch. And if Commissioner Wren gets the Liberal nomination, what about poor Mr Verhofstadt? What's he going to do? Perhaps he could challenge Mr Schulz for the Socialist nomination. I'm sure he'd feel more at home in that group. In fact, I think I'm one of the few people here who doesn't actually want to do your job. I'm perfectly happy with the one that I've got. The problem, of course, is that none of these potential candidates on show today represent any new ideas. They represent the vested interests of the past, the people of the European district in Brussels rather than the people of Europe. And next May, the choice won't be about anonymous candidates from political groupings that nobody's ever heard of. It will be about whether you want to merely shuffle the deck of cards or throw the deck out completely and start afresh. The essential flaw of the EU is that it simply doesn't trust the capacity of people and markets to overcome problems. Problems, we're told repeatedly here, can only be solved by more Europe. If somebody falls off a ladder somewhere in Europe, we need a new directive to solve it. People are not allowed to be trusted to decide their own working hours. They're not even to be allowed to take up e-cigarettes, to name another topical example. And when EU lawyers say that the financial transaction tax, so beloved of so many of you, is actually illegal, as they did yesterday, that doesn't matter, because nothing, even the law, should stand in the way of further European integration. We need a new Euro-realist direction with different ideas. One that says that patriotism is healthy. To be proudly German or French or Polish is not necessarily anti-European. The concepts are not antagonistic, and to want a new direction for Europe is not anti-European. The real anti-Europeans are those whose idea of change in the EU only means moving further in the old, failed direction. The real nationalists are those who force us to accept a European nation that the reality shows that nobody in Europe actually wants. And you know what? We've tried the old interventionist, centralising, socialist type approaches, and it may have been appropriate for the 1950s. Today, it is indeed well past its sell-by date. Let's try something different. Let's try a new approach. Perhaps we could rediscover the principle of freedom that many in Europe fashioned for the world, of opening our markets, of embracing enterprise, of eliminating the very many vested interests in the Union. Next year's elections will offer us an opportunity, not to advance European political parties and their candidates, beloved of many of us, but nobody in the real world has heard of them, but to give people a true choice, not about who you want steering the tanker, but actually whether you want the tanker to go in a different direction. Many of us want change. All of the polls indicate that the people of Europe want change. Next May, they'll have a chance to make a stand. They can say that they don't just want a new president for the EU, they want a new direction for it. Thank you.
Das Wort hat jetzt für die Fraktion der EFD Herr Farage.
Well, Mr Barroso, not just you, but the entire unelected government of Europe had a chance perhaps for our citizens to reflect on where the real power lies in this union. I've listened to you for nearly 10 years. Full marks for consistency. You know, you're a man that likes fixed ideology. You probably picked it up when you were a communist or Maoist or whatever you were. And for the last 10 years you've pursued Euro-federalism combined with an increasing green obsession. And yeah, it's been good. For bureaucrats, for big businessmen, for landowners, it's not been a bad decade. But it's been a disaster for poor people, unemployed people and those on low wages. The euro, which you believed would give us monetary stability, has done the very opposite. It was a misconstruction from the start, and it's pretty clear that youth unemployment at nearly 50% across the Mediterranean is probably nearly double what it would have been as a direct result of the misconstruction that is the euro. They're in the wrong currency, but I know that you'll never ever admit to that, and the euro, I think, will die a very slow and painful death. But you're all in denial about that. But it's the green agenda that I find really more interesting. You keep telling us that climate change is an absolute top priority, and you've been greeted with almost hysteria in this place over the last 10 years. Well, those of us that have been sceptical about this have been mocked, derided, called deniers. We've argued from the start that the science wasn't settled, and we've argued very strongly that the measures we're taking to combat what may or may not be a problem are damaging our citizens, and we've been proved to be right. Tens of millions forced into fuel poverty, manufacturing industry being driven away because, of course, our competitors in China and in America are going for cheap fossil alternatives, and, of course, wind turbines blighting the landscapes and seascapes of Europe. And still today you go on about green growth. Well, the consensus is breaking behind you. You know, Commissioner Tajani the other day said that actually we face a systematic industrial massacre. It is time to stop this stupidity, and to help you, there's the NASA photograph last August of the ice cap, the northern ice caps, and there is the NASA photograph this year of the ice caps. It is increased by 60% in 1 year. Leading American scientists are now saying we are going into a period of between 15 and 30 years of global cooling. We may have made one of the biggest, stupidest collective mistakes in history by getting so worried about global warming. You can reverse this in the next 7 or 8 months. You can bring down people's taxes. If you don't, they'll vote on it in the European elections of next year.
Mr. Callanan, you said, making a joke about possible competitors for the Commission election, that you are not interested in that job, that you are very happy with yours. Let me tell you very frankly that I think even if you were interested, you could not have a chance to be elected for President of the Commission. And you know why? I'm not saying that happily, because I think increasingly your party and your group is looking like the UKIP and the Eurosceptic anti-European group. And I start to have some doubts that you are going to be elected yourself in Britain if it's not UKIP that is going to be the first force in the British elections. Because when it comes to be against Europe, the people prefer, between the original and the copy, they prefer the original. That's probably why they are going to vote more for Mr. Farage than for Mr. Callanan. And this I don't say with any kind of satisfaction, because we have, even if we have some differences, we have worked in many areas very constructively with Conservatives, the British Conservatives and the Conservative group. We have worked together for the internal market, for reform. We have worked together against some kind of regulation. We have worked together in many areas, including free trade. But this is an important point, I think, because if those forces that are pro-European, or even those that are not really pro-European but constructive, have the same speech, the same political attitude of the anti-Europeans, the Eurosceptics, the populists, in that case, they will win the next election. So my appeal to you is to make the case for Europe. Mr. Farage shows that populists are sometimes obscurantists. 99% of the science, Mr. Farage, believes that this climate change exists as a result of human activity. 99% of scientists. Of course, there are always people that are paid to say the opposite. But to pretend, as you pretend, that against all science, well-established science, that the problem of climate change is just an invention of the Greens or of the left, it's completely nonsense. Of course we have to find a way. Of course we have to find a sensible way to fight climate change. We have to look at the same time for competitiveness in Europe. We have to make this part of our agenda for growth, and I believe that the green economy brings many possibilities.
Das Wort hat jetzt zunächst für die EFD-Fraktion Herr Farage.
Thank you. Well, next year's European elections will not be contested on the old division lines of left and right, and several group leaders have agreed with that today. Frankly, that's all irrelevant. It will be contested between those of us that believe in national democracy within the nation state and those that believe that the 28 countries that are part of the EU are better governed by these institutions. That, in a sense, is what this comes down to. But, Mr Barroso, those of us that believe in national democracy do not want to take us back to the Western Front or 1914. Those of us that believe in national democracy will say to you it is a healthy assertion of identity, but it also shows a deeper understanding of why the problems of Europe were caused in the past. It is democratic nation states in Europe that are stable, that will not go to war with each other, and I'd remind people, without the vote in the House of Commons 2 weeks ago, we would now be at war in Syria. What better proof can there be that nation-state democracy can be a force for good?
Das Wort hat jetzt für die ECR Herr Callanan. Herr Callanan, who?
Thank you, Mr.
Please,
President.
with pleasure.
Can I first of all thank Mr. Barroso for the unsolicited electoral advice for my party. It's a bit rich for the unelected head of the European Commission to give us electoral advice about how to pay for elections, but I suppose that's typical of him. Well, he's spoken for, I chatted up 55 minutes this morning in total, and of course he played his usual trick of having something for everyone. There was a little bit on a commitment to subsidiarity, which I welcome. I'd like to see it in action, but nevertheless I welcome it, and of course all the usual guff about more integration being required, more Europe being the solution to our problems, accompanied by also the usual scaremongering that somehow the alternative to ever closer integration is the trenches of the First World War. Come on, Mr. Barroso, nobody seriously believes that anymore. As usual, your speeches this morning were long on rhetoric, but your time in office has been very short on action. I really believe that those of us who believe in less Europe, in less integration, are actually starting to win the arguments in Europe now. Even Mr. Schulz, in his interview in Reuters yesterday, I was amazed. You said, if they quoted you correctly, that the EU can't do everything, and what you can do locally, you should do it there. Well, of course, we welcome the sinner that hath repenteth, but never mind, that's, we should appreciate from where it comes from. Mr. Barroso, your grand rhetoric, and the journalists in the press room have a terrible habit of playing buzzword bingo with your phrases to see whether you come out with your favourite phrases. I have to say my favourite from this morning, which I wrote down, is that you said we have to shape the new normal. Now I hope that makes sense in Portuguese, because I really don't know what it means in English.